Coming up this week on the right side, the Alberta NDP government throne speech goes to bat for pipelines. The Ironworkers Union in BC supports the Liberals and attacks the NDP over a lack of a jobs plan, and a look back at the refugee issue on the southern border. This is The Right Side, Episode 6, recorded Saturday, March 4th, 2017, a switching of roles. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another episode of The Right Side. Your fun co-hosts, Shane and Patrick, are here to discuss the right side news of the week. Welcome.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here, and there's lots been going on, that's for sure.
Yeah, not as large in magnitude as some weeks, I think, but definitely some things that need correcting in the record, and some things that were definitely glossed over, perhaps not looked at by the MSM, mainstream media, this week. And that is precisely what we're here to do. If you guys are just joining us for The Right Side for the first time, The Right Side is a podcast that aims to cut through the sensationalism and bias that appears in the mainstream media and deliver you the facts that the mainstream media might just be choosing to ignore or not choosing to present for ratings.
Yeah, or sometimes they try and editorialize or present their own opinions as facts, which we will always try and give it to you straight, you know? We'll give you the news, and then we'll tell you what we think. We won't try and say that either is the same thing.
Indeed. So we're going to start off with Alberta this week because nothing really huge happening on the Canada front this week except for a firing line segment, which will be in just a bit. But on the Alberta front this week, the government here, the NDP government, released their throne speech for this session of the legislature sitting. It's all in all a throne speech that is geared towards the people of Alberta, and your government was the central theme in this throne speech, rather than Alberta's new government or the NDP government. They also have said that in this throne speech they aim to continue slashing school fees, cap power bills, and create more affordable housing for families and seniors, as well as bringing in new mental health programs. And none of this was wildly off the mark from the NDP's stated goals of helping families and protecting Alberta's most vulnerable. So pretty much a steady as she goes kind of throne speech for the NDP, not willing to ruffle any feathers. That was last year's. But there's a few things to look at with this throne speech, especially with the economy. Expected to see a bit of improvement this year. The government wants to help families on their road to recovery. Whether or not you feel the government should be helping, that's a topic for another day. But once again, this is highlighting the fact that the NDP is with the people and not necessarily against them. Kind of striking a populist tone, I think, maybe just a bit in this throne speech. And, of course, that's when the government chooses to focus on the individual people rather than the whole society or overarching government, which we'll see if they manage to carry through with that. But perhaps one of the most interesting things from this throne speech was that near the end of it, they really stood up for pipelines in the most vocal way that they ever have before. We have the conditional approval of the Trans Mountain pipeline through BC. We have Keystone going to the United States. That's been approved by the new administration there. We just need to get the shovels in the ground on that. And, of course, we want one to the east as well. But Trans Mountain going through BC, the NDP government has said that they will fight in federal court and all that they can do to ensure that this pipeline is actually built. And they actually are also going to put more effort into the Energy East project all the way to New Brunswick as well, which, when you think of an NDP government, that's not normally the thing that first appears in the news now, is it?
No, and it's really interesting too because as we know, we're going to the polls here in BC in a couple months, and the our NDP have said that they're going to fight against the pipeline as much as they can, which is really interesting when you think that all of the provincial NDPs all are, a part of the same overarching like federal NDP party, right? So they're all generally on the same line. So it's kind of interesting that if disastrously the NDP actually do get in here, which is a very real possibility at this point, they might be fighting against each other, which doesn't really make sense on this. So
No, it doesn't.
let's hope they don't get in here because they might try and find some common ground to stop this.
Yeah, that would be pretty bad. And, all in all, this throne speech, like I said, was non-invasive and aimed to convey a steady-as-she-goes approach because the NDP are approaching mid-mandate and don't really want to do anything at this point, I think, to rock the boat. And the thing I think that was missed by everyone in this throne speech and why we're discussing it here is not the fact that pipelines are the central topic that the NDP wants to go forward. It's that there was very little said in this pipeline about stimulating small business by way of making sure the economy is growing, in that we reduce our government spending and slow the deficit growth and eventually work towards a plan of balance. There was nothing mentioned in the throne speech about that, about aiming to get the budget balance sooner than it should be. And also, of course, the bigger issue of all of this is the province's debt that is accumulating. Because as we discussed a couple weeks ago with the Alberta fiscal update on this podcast, I believe that was episode 4, Alberta is overspending and borrowing just to fund day-to-day services, which is like using the credit card to pay for groceries, which at the end of the day, if you don't have the money to begin with, you are accumulating debt, and that needs to be paid off by future generations. And that also builds up debt servicing costs because you need to pay interest on any kind of debt that you have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we're paying upwards of $1 billion on interest, then that money could just go to services instead. So I think what was missed by the throne speech and the media covering it in general is that, there was no ultimate focus on reducing debt and deficit. And
no, and not very much
framework.
Yeah, and there's not very much mention of the economy either, other than saying they're going to bat for the pipelines.
Right.
So it's almost like they're hinging on
solar.
that's going to go through.
Yeah, they're going to be creating a bunch of solar jobs as well, which, I mean, considering it's winter, 5 months of the year here, and we don't get much sun, and people aren't going to have the disposable income to put solar panels up, that seems like a boutique project for their base.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyways, these throne speeches come along every so often. So, of course, the main things we wanted to highlight were the fact that this NDP government is promoting pipelines more so than any NDP government in the past, but more so glossed over by the Edmonton Journal and most of the other media outlets where this article is from, not covering the debt and deficit and a potential way of reducing that going forward. All right. So what do you got for BC this week?
All right, so this is an interesting story I found. It is that the BC Ironworkers Union has now endorsed formally the BC Liberals, and at the same time they've attacked the NDP for the lack of jobs plan. So this is kind of interesting because they threw their support behind Premier Christy Clark, and they attacked their old allies in the NDP for failing to support their jobs and criticizing the BC Federation of Labour for its new anti-Liberal ad campaign. So the 1,800-member union felt abandoned by the NDP over the opposition of Site C and the George Massey Tunnel reconstruction project and the natural gas industry, all of which would provide thousands of jobs to laborers and construction builders. For those who don't know, the George Massey Tunnel is the tunnel that connects Richmond with Vancouver in the Lower Mainland. It's basically the main route you take to get to Vancouver and downtown if you're coming in from the ferries, if you're over here on the island, but also the main tunnel that comes in from people that live in Delta or in Surrey. So the quote here from Doug Parton, which is the business manager of the Ironworkers Local 97, he said, "We strongly believe that the Liberals have the best jobs plan and we're going to support them. That's what we're going to stand up for. I've been elected to do a duty as much as she has to support these guys. When they're not working, they're looking to me, and when I'm not working, I'm looking to her. So we all have people to answer to." He said that the workers don't agree with everything that the BC Liberals say, but he said that Clark's jobs plan is the best chance to create jobs for their members in the mining and bridge and dam construction.
Yeah, this is pretty much kind of what happened in the U.S. election where, the steelworkers unions, the coal workers unions went for Trump rather than Clinton, who is the Democrats of the Natural Union Party the last 40 years or so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they're not really looking for any overarching political promise. They're looking at what's happened in the past, I think, and they're seeing that their jobs have gotten better under the Liberals rather than what they were in the 90s under the NDP. So what's interesting is that they haven't actually formally endorsed a party in the past, but they have traditionally supported the NDP, and the former 1996 to 1999 NDP premier, Glenn Clark, which of course is no relation to Christy Clark, he was a key Ironworkers organizer as well within the organization. Parton also took a shot at the BC Federation of Labour's new attack ads, which depicted current Christy Clark as a video game character in a hard hat who poses for photo ops to collect points while closing schools and senior homes. I actually had a look at the ad itself while it was on TV, and it really was quite funny, to be honest. They did have a good sense of humor when they made it, but it just goes to show all the political ads that come out. They always try and portray the leaders in the most ridiculous light possible, right?
Yeah, and that's going to be something that's really interesting to watch going forward, because that can take on a whole new meaning with the internet and the rapid fire development world of Twitter and whatnot these days. So, one thing I find really interesting about this is that this is, I think, foreshadowing a larger trend that, a union worker might not necessarily always support the NDP. And, people tend to think that certain groups are taking votes for granted. And this just goes to show that the NDP should not take the BC union workers' votes for granted, because, as this one union says, they are supporting the Liberals. And I think that thing can be extended outwards to all other groups, in that we're in a time where allegiances can change like this. So it's very important for all parties and all groups to keep their pulse, or keep their finger on the pulse of what's happening, to know whether the tide is changing beneath them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It can be taken not just as this single union throwing their support behind them. I think it could be taken as, if this one does, maybe others want to as well. And they're just afraid that they can't because of either their union higher-ups or because of the expectation amongst people that they will go for the NDP.
Right.
So maybe it'll open the floodgates for other people as we get closer and closer to the election here.
Yeah, and I think that this could be attributed to the Alberta NDP's win in 2015. It's not that people wanted an NDP government, it's that they wanted a general protest vote, and that was the NDP in this case, even though they were not necessarily comfortable with traditional NDP policies. And I think that's one of the biggest things going forward as we look to 2019 in the federal race as well, is that if the public truly does sour on the current government and they're looking for an alternative, and the Conservatives, who are the natural replacement to the Liberals at this time, aren't able to capitalize on that, you could maybe see an NDP government federally, because they came pretty close in 2011. Well,
the interesting thing is that Trudeau seems in his social policies to be drifting closer and closer to the Conservatives rather than towards the NDP. Now, in the election, he took away a lot of votes from the NDP because he was, a younger guy, but he was also, standing up for students and, legalizing marijuana and all that sort of thing, which was pretty close to the NDP platform, right?
Yeah.
So he took a lot of votes that way. The interesting, when it comes to BC, there is no real Conservative Party here that actually does well in politics. The Liberal Party is basically an amalgamation of Liberal and Conservative supporters. It's basically the not NDP party. So if there was a protest vote against Clark, and she does have her detractors after all, a party that's 16 years in power doesn't not pick up detractors. I think what's interesting is the protest vote would probably go to the NDP, and I think people have to realize that might not be a good thing.
Yeah, and I mean, if it comes down to positive development and expansion in the economy through growth and resource projects, which the Liberals seem to be for, or the NDP, who are not for that, but the NDP or the protest vote, that could definitely have some negative side effects going forward. And ultimately, I think that's something to watch out for, because if you don't have a strong economy, you really don't have a decent framework to do the rest of your government mandate or platform that you get elected to carry out.
Yeah, and we've been down this road before. I mean, we had the NDP in power for most of the 1990s, and the reason why the Liberals have been in for 16 years is because no one wanted to go back to that. So unless there's anything's changed, I'm just going to think that things are much the same as they were back then, and they're probably not going to lead us through economic growth.
Yep. All right. I think we can move on to our story from the rest of Canada then.
I think the last thing I have to say is that Clark joked on the topic of that attack ad. She said, "I'm glad I was in a hard hat. At least that's one thing they got right."
A hard hat, the symbol of the worker, always.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
So I think we can move on to our Canada story. This is the Cyber Spy Service eyes political blackmail as part of the Democratic Risk Assessment. So this was something interesting that came up that I don't think anyone was really talking about that much. I did not certainly see this until you brought it up.
Yeah, it wasn't covered in the in any of the major newscasts, so it's a very important story, I think.
Yeah. So this was the threat of political blackmail could figure in a wide-ranging review of risks to Canada's electoral system, and this was from a senior official from the National Cyber Spy Agency. He says, safeguarding personal information on voter lists, ensuring election ballot tallies aren't manipulated, and preventing fake news from swaying the public might also be part of the study, said Scott Jones, the communications security establishment. He said he's also mindful of forces that can unduly influence public thinking, such as fake news and ill-informed tweets. Quote, "Our opinions could be shaped by a Facebook post with no way of determining whether it's legitimate or not," end quote. He said it's unclear how far the review will delve into such interference or whether anything can be done about it.
Okay, so, at the surface, this seems like a story where we want to just protect the integrity of the electoral system, which in itself is a noble goal, right? I mean, if we don't have an electoral system, how are we supposed to choose individuals to represent us?
Mm-hmm.
So,
and how is our government legitimate if the electoral system is broken?
Now, all in all, I think that we're doing a great job going forward. We have decent voter ID laws. They're not draconian, and pretty much anyone who wants to and is eligible can figure out how to vote. Now, I don't know about you or our listeners out there, but I'm a huge fan of the paper ballot. And also knowing a bit about computer security and information security in general, I know that you cannot design a new system from the ground up and say it's secure, because the only way security is truly obtained in the world is by putting that system out there and exposing it to bad actors. Now, that doesn't mean that any system that gets put online is going to have security faults in it. It could take a while for them to be found out. But, that's just one reason why I think with voting systems in particular, it's really important to stay as old-fashioned as we can, i.e. pencil and paper. But the troubling part about this story is that disguised underneath this democratic risk assessment, they are looking towards social media, Facebook and Twitter, and preventing fake news. Now, fake news is bad, and that's one of the things that we aim to cut down on here at the right side, and what we want to kind of trim away from the rest of the mainstream media outlets, because I think whether you're looking at the CBC, Global, or the Rebel, each of them has fake news to some degree, whether or not it's actually marketed as such and as hyped up and as sensationalized. And that's what we're trying to prevent. Now, putting that online, it can spread like wildfire, which is why this wants to obviously be discussed by this democratic risk assessment. But at the end of the day, anything that's done to so-called limit fake news spreading around could ultimately be seen as a curb on freedom of expression or freedom of speech of the citizenry. So that's something that really needs to be thought of carefully when going through this. And that's why when I came across this story, it was such a shock that we hadn't heard anything about this in the mainstream media, because the mainstream media seems to like cutting down or trying to cut down on fake news these days.
Yeah, without actually doing it themselves.
That's right.
And something else that's interesting to note is they want to cut down on fake news and probably put in legislation to do that, since it would be democratic reform and security and whatnot. But I think the real interesting thing here is that you could probably equate this to past attempts to put in legislation about reducing spam on your computer.
Right.
And I think the interesting thing here is that it's interesting to see whether it would actually be effective or not, whether they could, curb fake news online, because attempts in the past to legislate about usage online haven't really been met with much effectiveness, because it is online.
The only way it's going to be truly successful is if you have a Twitter and a Facebook office in each country and they take orders from the government on what to remove.
Yeah, exactly. And
which, if you do that, you're heading down the path of dictatorships like China.
Yeah, and regulating of companies that just creates more tax and more. You have to provide people with government jobs to be able to oversee all this sort of thing, and they're going to require a salary, and it's just more government spending on something that might not even be a problem. Yeah, or right. Effective. Like, maybe it is a problem, but this is not the right way to go about it. So it's something that really should be talked about, but I'm not really sure if there's anything the government can actually do about it.
Yeah, and I mean, anytime you're putting a task force together like this, they are going to look for problems. And, until I think it's proven that the government in general has a good cybersecurity strategy, there's definitely going to be some questions about how this is being carried out. And granted, this is early days for this. I don't see anything coming from this in time for the 2019 race, maybe beyond. We'll just have to wait and see on this, I think. But once again, this was not covered at all. This came from a rather obscure website that most people might not go to called National News Watch, which is actually a news website that aggregates these lesser-known pieces out there. So,
yeah, and I've never heard of it before. So it just goes to show that you have to look at a wide variety of sources. So when you're looking at news, you can't just go to the normal ones.
Indeed. All right. Well, there's our Canada story, and we're also going to move into our firing line segment right now, which is a follow-up from a previous Canada story. So the headline from this firing line is that BC Refugee Centre reports sharp jump in asylum seekers. So this is a follow-up from episode 4, and in episode 4 we discussed a story that discussed our refugee problem on the southern border in places like Manitoba and Quebec. So we're looking back at this because the problem really has not been addressed recently. There was some developing news earlier today on Saturday, which we'll get to in just a bit. But first, here's the background on this. So between April of last year and February 15th of 2017, Vancouver's Welcome Centre dealt with 1,140 refugee claimants compared to 801 from the 2015-16 fiscal year. And about 80% of these came here by crossing through the Peace Arch Park border crossing or nearby, avoiding the controlled border crossings where they would be refused entry. The facility where these refugees had to go to get services like temporary housing and primary care had 99 new clients in January and 84 the next month. And these are unusually high numbers, according to Chris Friesen, who is in charge of settlement services for the Immigrant Services Society, which operates as a welcome center in Vancouver. Whereas in December, there were only 63 new clients. Most of those who walked across the border have been Kurdish-speaking Iraqis, including families and single men, but there have also been several young families from Afghanistan. Iraqis made up the biggest overall portion of recent new arrivals, with at least 65 over the last 3 months. Then there's a but in this story, and it relates to a policy change that the Trudeau government made last year. Mexicans are also making up a growing segment of the Welcome Center's clients. 22 got services there in February and 7 the month before. In comparison, there were just 30 the entire year leading up to December 1st when Canada officially lifted the requirement for Mexican visitors to carry visas. Now that the asylum seekers can arrive from Mexico as tourists, most make refugee claims at the Vancouver International Airport. Meanwhile, refugee crossings in Manitoba and Quebec and even Saskatchewan are increasing. Ralph Goodale said recently this past week that the government was looking into the situation. Now, we have heard from Goodale today. He said that they are going to be giving an additional $30,000 to the town of Emerson, Manitoba, which is seeing the bulk of these border crossings to help them deal with the situation so that their services are not overloaded. But with that being said, we also have not heard from the Prime Minister or the Immigration Minister on this. And this whole issue could have easily been fixed with a minor amendment to the agreement between Canada and the U.S. And this is slowly turning into our own illegal immigration problem. And just before we move on here, Manitoba is actually the hot spot, and here are some numbers for Manitoba. There have been 143 crossings in 2017, 39 of which between the 22nd and 27th of February. The media has covered this sparingly over the past few weeks, but they ultimately attribute it to President Trump, and they don't address that the government could stop this immediately if they so choose to. They also seem to be unaware that the immigration minister or prime minister should be asked for comment and perhaps driven to do something on this file.
And they also seem to be unaware that this isn't a new thing since Trump got elected back in November or, became the president in January. It's been happening before. I mean, it hasn't been happening as much, but it's still been happening. And it's interesting to see that in different parts of the country, we're seeing different majorities from different nationalities or religious groups or language-speaking groups. Because I know that I think it was Quebec, there was a higher number from Yemen. Right. And
there was some from Somalia somewhere else, I believe, too. That was the majority.
I think Somalia was Manitoba.
Okay.
And here it seems to be Iraqis and Afghanistanis. And
I think we have a good immigration program and a good refugee program, going all the way back to Vietnam and Kosovo War and whatnot. And, we do our job when it comes to refugees. We do our job when it comes to peacekeeping. And our systems are built to handle this amount of refugees. But when people are skirting that system, it ruins the system for everyone. And this is not a call to ultimately scale back these systems. It's a call to enforce the law. Because if you're not enforcing the law for some reason that you don't want to be seen as, looking like maybe you're being tough on the border like President Trump is doing, or like the conservatives would do, or some like in the race would do, if you're just doing it for the pure virtue to say that, hey, we're doing this to make us feel good and make everyone feel good, then you're doing a disservice to the country. And I think that's in large part what this government is doing. And, I've long said that Ralph Goodale is the face of wisdom on this government. And, it's good that he is the front for this. So I think he's doing a good job. I just wish the rest of the government would step up and offer a concrete solution so we're not dealing with this minor problem and having it become bigger.
Yeah, and I think what's fascinating about this story is that the government's kind of creating a double standard when you think about it. If you look at the news recently, you'll see that Trudeau has been calling on police officers to enforce the law when it comes to marijuana dispensaries across the nation. There's been some here in Victoria, Vancouver. I know there's been in Toronto where they've been raided, and he's been saying, yes, good, enforce the law because we haven't made legislation making it legal. Now you look at this, and he's not saying to enforce the law. They're kind of just letting it happen. So if he wants them to enforce the law in some ways but not in others, that's kind of a double standard, and I think really should be talked about a bit more. I don't think any news story I've read has been mentioning that.
Right,
at all.
And it's not even talking about the problem that this creates. It's all about welcoming the refugees and painting the U.S. administration in a bad light, which is why it's our firing line segment this week. But anyways, we're running out of time here, so I believe we got our word of the week.
Yeah, so our word of the week is refugee. This is defined by dictionary.com as a person who flees for refuge or safety, especially to a foreign country, as in time of political upheaval or war, etc.
There's no war going on in the United States right now.
Nor can there really be described as political upheaval. I mean, they elected a president, and maybe for some his policies are a bit out there, and but I don't think you can describe it as upheaval. I mean, there's been no revolution. There's been no coup. I mean, it's hard to call these people that are coming across the border illegally as refugees. And it's been interesting to see the language that different news sites use for these people. A lot of them will say refugees, a lot of them will say asylum seekers, and you always know which ones are the conservative ones because they'll say illegal immigrants. And none of them are false when you think about it. I mean, they are crossing the border illegally. That's a fact. That's not even an opinion. They are seeking asylum. They are seeking asylum.
And they are refugees, though. They're refugees in the U.S.
You can call them refugees, but it's just interesting that the language that people use to describe the issue.
Indeed. All right. Well, there's your word of the week, folks. Not much else left to say on this episode of The Right Side. If you want to find us, we're at rightsidenews.ca, full show notes and more there. If you want to chat with us, we're on Twitter and Facebook at RightSideCA. And if you want to subscribe to us and have us automatically delivered to your phone or iPod, rightsidenews.ca/iTunes. All right. We're good.
I think that finishes us out for the week. We will see you next time.
Thank you for sharing your time with us.